Well, fellas, we're back, and it's that time of the year where we talk about some of the best games that came out in the prior year. And with 2023, oh boy, man, there was a whole lot of great games. So without further delay, let's just get into it. Now, even I gotta admit, fellas, that usually I say, oh yeah, this year has so many great games, but 2023 has delivered more than most other years, and it's been wild. While I wouldn't go out on a limb and say that there's many Señales level masterpieces out there, which, to be fair, only comes out around once in a blue moon, it seems that this year has been filled with so many games in that comfy 8 out of 10 spot that it's almost hard to figure out where to start playing. And thankfully with this list, as it is with every year, I will be able to give you what I believe to be 10 great games that no matter if you're a strategy, RPG, or an FPS fan, you'll hopefully find something on my list that will catch your eye. But of course, before we get into the top 10, we gotta talk about some honorable mentions that I always have. These games are games that either, just don't quite make it onto my list very narrowly, a top 11 if you will, or sometimes in certain cases they didn't even come out this year and I just got around to playing it finally, so let's talk about those. Starting off the honorable mentions is Blasphemous 2, that somehow in a year so jam full of games, and in one that I have personally played and completed over 30 new games, I never sadly got the chance to give this a try before finalizing my list. For those unawares, Blasphemous 2 is the sequel to 2019's Blasphemous, which is a very interestingly styled Metroidvania / Souls-like / whatever other buzzword you want to give to a game like this, developed by Spanish developers The Game Kitchen, that used a lot of cultural influences from Seville to create the world of Custodia. In Blasphemous 2, the Penitent One, the character from the first game, returns to defeat the evil forces of the Miracle, a sort of twisted warped deity that enjoys slurping up all the misery and torture of the masses crying out for salvation. The Penitent One already defeated the Miracle once, and God's damned he'll do it again, but this time with even more weapons to defeat more baddies and more exotic locales, still inspired by Seville and Spain in general. Basically what I'm saying is that Blasphemous 2 seems just like more Blasphemous, which is absolutely fine in my book. And if you fellas are interested on the first game, then I got a video on that if you fellas are interested in this world, it's gonna make you self-flagellate, just like in Custodia. So if you want to play a neat ass, wonderfully pixelated game where you're running around with a capirote and a big ass sword killing a bunch of people, then I would go out and check Blasphemous 2 because it might just be up your alley. Second on my list of honorable mentions is Kazutaka Kodaka's latest game series and Master Detective Archives Raincode, which is the next step for his murder mystery brain after wrapping up the Danganronpa games earlier in 2017. Raincode can only be described as basically Danganronpa, but taking the weird ass elements of it and cranking that stuff up to 11, which for a game spawned from Danganronpa doesn't even really seem possible, but I assure you fellas it's very much real. In Raincode, you play the role of Yuma Cocohead, one of the detectives sent out by the World Detective Agency to go to the closed city of Kanai Ward and figure out its ultimate secret, which will surely entail going through a variety of murders to get to the bottom of things. Aided by Shinigami, which is our lovable big-boobed bitch co-star, you will have to go through a series of different murders a la Danganronpa style, just with the mini-games being a little bit different and taking advantage of some not-so, mighty hardware. And while I had a decent bit of fun with Raincode, it ultimately falls short on my list for a few issues, some concerning the narrative and a whole lot more concerning the system that it's on. To start with the narrative, while not bad by any means, it never really seemed to get to the heights of Danganronpa with its character or the grander narrative. Sure, it picks up towards the end and has a satisfying conclusion, but there's a lack of investment on the characters when a lot of the killers and the killed are just randos that you find on the street. Danganronpa never really had this issue since by the premise of the game, the ones who can kill or be killed are one of the 16 that you start the game with. So there's this tension when you never really know if the cute babe that you've been hanging out with is gonna get her head split open, or throw your other friend into a giant press and smush him to death. More importantly though is that I genuinely feel that this game is being held back with some of the worst hardware on the planet, and that is of course the Nintendo Switch. 2Kyo Games went more ambitious with the scope, the mechanics, and the aesthetic of the game, but ultimately the Switch just can't really handle the game to a level that would satisfy all those feels. The game constantly chugs, I've had several crashes on it, and models and sprites look great, but the environment looks like ass, and worst of all, it's running at like 20 frames per second. Though I'm very hopeful for the next Master Detective Archives because I think they have a very good base to do more games from, but we'll leave it at that, and we're going to talk about the next game, which is a game by my good friend Maldo19. This section will hopefully be a bit shorter than the rest since I've already done a video on Maldo's latest game, Nightmare Zapping, but since he's a friend, I really wanted to give a shout out to him for all the work that he has put through for the game. Essentially, Nightmare Zapping is a charming little horror game where you will be zapping through various TV channels that showcase the horrors infecting two small towns in Chile that can range between an entity slowly corrupting a family and consuming them, or using other means like putting you in a hot date with Amelia and then consuming you in other ways. It's not a particularly large game and it will only take maybe an hour or two to complete, but I think that if you have the spare cash you can pick this bad boy up and feel what it feels like to watch late night public access spooky TV in Chile, and hopefully it will lead you down the road to grabbing Maldo's other games like the wonderful Horror of Salazar House, which I also have a video on if you want to check that out. Yeah, I know, it might seem like a lot of shilling on this channel, but come on, man. He's a good friend of the channel, good friend of mine, and so I had any opportunity, I'm gonna help shill his stuff. So if you haven't, go play Nightmare Zapping because it's great. Final game on the honorable mentions for 2023 is of course going to be none other than Persona 5 Royal, developed by resident Tomcast favorite Fatless. And for those unaware, Royal is basically the enhanced version of Persona 5, just like how there's Persona 4 Golden and Persona 3 Festival. Being the enhanced version of Persona 5, Royal fleshes out the experiences by mixing both what Persona 3 FES and Golden does and adding more characters and events throughout the experience that will eventually culminate in an extra month at the end of the game that wonderfully ties the whole thing together. And while I did buy Royal for the PS4 way back in 2021, I didn't really give it the chance that it deserved since the game had just sort of released by then, and for me, in a Persona game, is kind of like a huge time commitment. So it wasn't really till this summer, where being bored at my former security guard job, that I tried out xCloud for the first time and started playing Royal just to pass the time. And with the magic of Game Pass, those hours on the phone quickly got synced up with the save on my PC, and I would seamlessly jump between the two mediums to enjoy my game, eventually just settling on PC due to me changing jobs and not needing to do it on the cloud anymore. And what started out as a necessity to go through a very boring day ended up becoming one of the most enjoyable experiences of the year, with not just rediscovering how great Persona 5 is, but seeing how much new stuff they added throughout the experience that really turned it into kind of a completely new game for me. I especially enjoyed the new characters of Kasumi and Dr. Maruki that start off as these wonderful new confidants that you could do that eventually, through the new conclusion of the game, become some of my favorite characters in the game. Hell, they even fleshed out Akechi's new confidant that made him more of a sympathetic character, but in the end he turned into a character that I now love to hate instead of just a groaner that I hated throughout the original Persona 5. And there is of course a variety of new gameplay mechanics, personas, and new soundtracks to enjoy that fill out the game into a much more complete experience that was just honestly an absolute treat to go through. But even though it was one of my favorite experiences of the year, it's not on the list because, well, it came out in 2021. And even then, I don't think expansions or enhanced editions really warrant a spot on the list in my opinion. Thankfully, these days you can grab Persona 5 Royal on pretty much everything between Xbox, PlayStation, and Switch and PC, and I would highly recommend a playthrough, especially if you haven't played it or any other Persona game before. And with that, fellas, we've made it to the end of the honorable mentions. I don't know if it was longer than last year's, but whatever. With a year so full of stuff like 2023, you can't help but actually, talk about it. So with that, let's finally head on to the top 10 with number 10.
Number 10.
Debuting into the world all the way back in 2020 in early access comes our first game, World of Horror, developed by Panstas, who comes from the land of Poland to deliver us a wonderfully spooky, particularly 80s Japanese rendition of a classic board game that some of us might know as Eldritch Horror or Arkham Horror, finally getting a 1.0 release in 2023. World of Horror wonderfully mixes a bunch of different influences that individually might seem cliched, but when combined all together makes for something really incredible. Like a mad Polish scientist, which honestly might be a little bit redundant, Panstats combines 1-bit graphics like computers of yore with a very Junji Ito 1980s inspired aesthetic that dips its toes into some Lovecraftian themes and influences by taking the rule set and general playstyle of Eldritch Horror and mixing it into a nasty, spooky elixir. World of Horror will have you picking a variety of Japanese teams from the 80s, followed by whichever eldritch god you want to tackle for that session, and the game will generate for you a series of mysteries that need to be solved to thwart the dark impossible gods before their minions kill you, or the influences of dark powers finally drive you insane. What's wild about World of Horror is that you basically take three things that I enjoy, which is Eldritch Horror, Junji Ito, and H.P. Lovecraft, and then you grind them down into one essence, and man oh man, that essence is wonderful. So with that, let's talk about the gameplay. Without trying to dumb it down too much, since there's certainly a lot more than meets the eye with World of Horror, but it really does feel like a lot of the great rules of Eldritch Horror were taken to create a sandbox narrative adventure, where the key goals is to successfully make it to the end of several mysteries without incurring too many injuries or losing too much of your sanity. The method where you lose your health and sanity has to do with many events that come from a pool from which World of Horror will be drawn from. It could be something as simple as a weird series of murders happening at a school done with scissors, to a curious case of evolving eels that might have the secret to everlasting life or a quick death when implanted within your body. It's in these mysteries where you will encounter certain beings or obstacles that will cause you harm depending on the choices that you have to make. The game might give you the opportunity to open that creepy door, follow that band of cultists into the woods, or a quick option between fighting or fleeing the thing without a face. Make the wrong choice and you might get some nasty wounds, blinding you or breaking a limb, while the right choice might net you some items that will help you down the road. Perhaps even an ally or two, but sometimes the game gives you another mystery in your hands, such as a spell of unknown compacts, an ancient tome that can bring wrath and ruin to your enemies, or a part of an old god that makes you, for once in your life, truly see, with all its consequences. And while the gameplay might not be too crazy, enjoyers of the board game will have a great time with the amount of mysteries at hand, for the sandbox element of the game is the modern electronic version of pulling up different cards and reading what's going on. Not to mention that there's a variety of different options to augment your game to be an easy or difficult as you want it to be, also choosing the gods and mysteries you want to tackle at your own discretion or your own horror. You can really just homebrew it into whichever way you want to play the game. You can choose these gods with these kinds of difficulty, with these special mysteries, and then when you die, load an old save to figure it out all over again without dying, or hell, even start from scratch with different mysteries and different gods. Though I gotta say, fellas, even though I love Eldritch Horror, what Panstas has done by mixing all these influences together is short of incredible, and it leaves a cool product. You take on one end the land of the rising sun in its heyday of the 1980s with cute girls, boxy great cars, and awesome anime such as Zeta Gundam. And then you add those influences of disappearances and creeps hanging around the high school, in the sleepy, idyllic Japanese villages in the woods, or in the weirdly abandoned hospital that should be bustling with people, culminating into an ultimate horrific realization of what truly lurks in the shadows, that was so exquisitely written by the maestros of Junji Ito and H.P. Horsascraft. Then you take all those influences and get Panstas to painstakingly crunch them out for the world to see in MS Paint, bit by goopy bit, and you got something cool that you just don't really find anywhere else. Panstas has done such a neat way of drawing that it makes it feel like the works of Junji Ito is coming to life in a very respectful and faithful manner. Certainly better than those animated Junji Ito adaptations from quite a few years ago back that are just terrible. These sorts of graphics also make it incredibly easy for most people to enjoy the game, which can probably be ran from anything like a Potato Max 9000 to the alien PCs being dug up in Groom Lake. Ultimately, World of War is one of those games that I'm honestly kind of surprised to see on this list, because when I did my video on it a while back, basically we didn't know if there was going to be a new update or a 1.0 because there was a long hiatus at that point, but I'm so glad that Pantstas finally came around to releasing a 1.0 and hopefully more stuff in the future. If you want to grab a wonderful game that is a lot like a board game with some really cool influences, you can typically find World of Horror online for around €20 or $25 Canadian, and it can be played through most major platforms, though it's missing on Xbox at the moment, but it will hopefully be released soon. Nice little gem that we have here, brewing as an appetizer at number 10, but from here on out, fellas, we're going to have FPSs, we're going to have CRPGs, and a whole bunch of other cool stuff. So with that, let's get on to number 9.
Number 9.
Junk space. The remnants of an industrial space mining operation abandoned after a minor mutiny. The rebels succeeded, but cut off from Earth. They found themselves effectively in a prison with no chance to return. And now, 20 years later, after an ill-advised detour on a routine trip, you, a newbie captain, are stuck here too. The only way to get back is to repair the damaged ship. You must find your way amongst all the wreckage and defunct equipment, jump from one derelict station or wreck to another, looking to scavenge the fuel chip you desperately need.
In the deep, dark land of the Baltics comes Space Wreck, a short but incredible CRPG experience from the great folks at Bodies Entertainment, where they have shown us what you can do with such a short runtime and endless replayability. I've sort of done a video on Space Wreck before, so I don't want to retread too much ground, but basically the game's super short, which is another reason I don't want to talk about it, so I'll try to explain it as best I can. Space Wreck takes us to the near future where you are the captain of a soon-to-be destroyed spacecraft after a pirate attack, leaving you damaged and low-fueled. Your fellow Latvian crewmen all draw straws to see who will venture out into the space wreck to gather what you need, and so it seems that it's up to you to go out and get everyone home safely because you pulled the short straw. Now, to start off with the writing, Space Wreck isn't going to win any awards, but what it does have going for it is the typical variant of Baltic charm that seems to permeate through all the Latvians that I've met. Also, the interactions that you're going to have with our other crew members, space pirates, and space junkers are typically set up in a fashion for the most comical of outcomes to occur, like venting people out into space or leaving them stranded in a compartment with little air remaining and the only food is a bottle of Riga Black Balsam. Though I have to say that my favorite element of the writing in Space Wreck has to do with all the Latvian and Baltic influences, ranging from the names of characters and ships, like having a competing junker vessel be known as the Spiritis, or certain items like the aforementioned Riga Black Balsam that shows up as a drink to enjoy. In general, I really enjoy when people of various different cultures come together and make a game that really showcases the different parts of it, because there really aren't a whole lot of games out there that get to bring a little bit of Latvia to our screens, and for that, well, puts a big smile on my face. Now that's all well and good, but the bulk of Space Wreck's experience actually comes in its gameplay, and it does something different by making the game really short, but in so many different ways wholly replayable, which is so cool. So let's get onto the gameplay for a bit. The main element that seems to differentiate Space Wreck from the variety of other CRPGs of 2023, especially compared to the big ones like Baldur's Gate 3, is that while the game is not very long, it can be finished in about, kind of 6 hours, but in that span of time, you're going to be able to complete the game in a plethora of different ways. Take one of the first big quests, for instance, which is trying to find some damn gas for your spaceship so you can leave the area. You can help the competing junker crew get into the fuel storage area, to which they will help you to a bit of the spoils, or perhaps you can reprogram all the security bots of the station to kill the others and just use a bit of the pieces that they've already collected to get to the salvage. And last but not least, you can always just sneak on board their already fueled up spaceship and just, kind of take it for yourself, circumventing the whole ordeal by taking advantage of some very dissatisfied crew members. But to be honest, fellas, there's probably even more ways to complete that one quest, because Space Wreck really does give you the amount of freedom to go about your little dysfunctional adventure however you please, to the point of making your head spin with all the different possibilities. course, with a CRPG, there's many things to talk about, but I'm going to leave it there, and we're just going to head into the presentation for a little bit. To cap it off with the aesthetics, I will just say that Space Wreck takes a very classical approach to how it looks, and very wonderfully takes us back to the past with its mix of very old school sprites that look like the original Fallouts or even Planescape Torment, and then add in some relatively simple 3D models that wouldn't look out of place in the long-lost Van Buren version of Fallout 3. Sure, it doesn't have the pizzazz of some newer CRPGs, but the visuals and sounds gets the job done to make a truly unique CRPG experience that in the end I really enjoyed a lot more than some of the big boys. And while I don't have a dishonorable mention, but in my humble opinion, Space Wreck did everything for me that Baldur's Mid 3 couldn't, by taking hold of my attention and giving a great, enjoyable fun time for those few hours, without, wasting my time and kinda keeping me bored for 90 hours. But anyway, Space Wreck can be found on Steam for a solid €16 or $22 Canadian, which for the type of game that it is and the huge amount of replayability at your disposal, makes for an easy recommendation at that price. And if you're still doubting it a bit, then might I suggest play the demo to see if it's something up your alley. And there we go, fellas. That's one CRPG down, and without spoiling it too much, we got another CRPG to go. But with that, let's head on to number 8.
Number 8.
It is time to purge the heretics. Unleash your wrath upon the enemies of the Imperium. Plunge headlong.
More years go by, and the only truth in these passing years is that in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there's only a bunch of cool new 40k games to enjoy. And one of our first ones on this list today is the classy boomer shooter Warhammer 40,000 Bolt Gun, developed by Auroch Digital. It really is a blessing these days that at least one good Warhammer 40k game will come out every year, because man oh man, I used to live during the droughts, and oh boy, those droughts were nasty, because some of the slop that came out during those days, bad. Warhammer 40,000 Bolt Gun is a sort of semi-sequel to 2011 Space Marine, where instead of taking control of Captain Titus of the Ultramarines chapter of Adeptus Astartes, aka Space Marines, you play the wonderfully named Milium Caido, which quite literally means evil falls in Latin. Tasked by the Inquisition to clean up the mess that Titus inadvertently started in the events of Space Marine, Kaido, with a not-so-fortunate squad of Sternguard veterans, will have to go back to the Forge world of Graia and figure out what sort of chaos shenanigans are going on. So with your drop pod landed and all your battle brothers dead, you'll have to brave yourself through the different parts of Graia by yourself with a righteous chainsword in one hand and your trusty bolter in the other. It's a pretty simple premise for a Warhammer game, but come on man, like it's a boomer shooter. What else do you need? You just need a reason to point at the bad guys, which is you in this case in the camera, and then you go and you shoot them. Like, for the folks out there that still don't know, which at this point I might add, you're either probably new to the channel or you just don't pay attention to me at all, because if you're not aware what boomer shooters are, they're basically modern recreations of low poly first person shooters from back in the day with varying degrees of faithfulness. The genre runs the gamut from games like Dusk that feel like a game that could have been slotted into the 90s and nobody would have known, to more recent outings like Ultra Kill that take a lot of the influences from Devil May Cry and put that into the skin of a shooter. Bolt Gun is one of these many shooters that honestly is kind of like Dusk, because it could have been put there with the likes of Doom, Wolfenstein, Duke Nukem, and Blood, and nobody would have been none the wiser. Big key, of course, is that it takes place in the Warhammer 40,000 IP and adds its own influences to make it not just a neat 40k game, but a great damn little boomer shooter that makes me think, damn, why didn't anybody think of this in the 90s? As expected of a game set in the 41st millennium, where you play one of the venerable Space Marines, you have a whole array of weaponry available to an Astartes, ranging from the titular bolt gun to scorching plasma weapons, melta-guns that will evaporate your worst foes, and even the Vengeance launcher that was featured in 2011's Space Marine. And all these weapons are cool and all, but what Bolt Gun does with the weapons is really interesting, and that brings us to the strength and toughness system. Taking some influences from the tabletop game, in Bolt Gun there's a sort of strength versus toughness mechanic where whichever weapon that you have equipped needs to have the right firepower to counteract whatever you're attacking. So say you're fighting against your typical rinky-dink cultists, basically anything in Kaido's arsenal will do the trick for turning them into piles of gore. But the second you come across a Chaos Terminator, then you might need something more powerful than your trusty bolter, perhaps like a melt-a-gun to evaporate the heretic. Essentially every weapon and every enemy has corresponding strength and toughness, respectively, that you need to take into account when fighting enemies, and heck, this even goes into the grenades, where there's being normal frag grenades to heavier crack grenades, which come in handy when dispatching the endless legions of the Neverborn, spawned from the Dark Gods. Now this might seem like a big pain in the butt having to use certain weapons on certain enemy, and I'm just gonna say that it's not that reductive, as pretty much all weapons work to defeat the enemies of the Imperium. But if you use the right weapon for the right job, then this whole mechanic will become second nature, and you'll be switching through weapons and blasting heretics like a wonderful ballet to the tune of 9 Inch Nails' Pretty Hate Machine. Now I don't typically do this, but I'm going to put in the narrative and the presentation together because there's not really enough to talk about either, but when you put together it actually kind of works out, so let's talk about the narrative and the presentation. If you have played your fair share of 40k games, then you likely know that the story is not going to win any awards in Bolt Gun, but in general the story of Kaido trying to clean up Captain Titus's mess does a good job of getting you from dystopic gothic sprawl to even more gothic and more dystopic locations. Moving beyond that, the main highlights for me come from the masterfully crafted pixel art that perfectly replicates the looks of many well-known models found throughout the tabletop game, and especially the legions of the heretic Astartes. Though I won't be lying in saying that I have a soft spot for some of the Chaos Demons like the Zinchian Blue Horrors or the Plague Toads from Grandfather Nurgle's Garden, that add that extra splash of color that make them pop out from the rest of the Legions of Chaos. Best showcase for the sprite work has to be the cutscenes shown at the start of certain chapters that are really damn cool and makes me wish there were more of them throughout the game. And now it might seem like it's literally perfect, but I do have a few gripes that I'll kind of be honest in saying are more like nitpicks, but whatever, I'm gonna say them anyways. I wish that the artists sometimes would have gone just a little bit of an extra mile in the way of some of the models and taking more inspiration from some classic 40k art and models from the olden times. Like there's an entire treasure trove of ugly ass sin 2nd edition Chaos Space Marines, but in Bolt Gun these are the really clean newer models that while they look good would look even greater as the old models, especially since they went out of the way to give Kaido the classic Mark VI beaky helmet that was a mainstay in a lot of the old models and art. And my other gripe is a really specific one that I don't really remember if they explain it or not, but in 2011 Space Marine, the Chaos Warband in that game are a specially made warband known as the Chosen of Nemeroth, which was the game's big baddie, but it seems like in Bolt Gun that they're just all normal Black Legion guys, which is the bog standard Chaos Legion to see in the 41st millennium. I know it's not anything world-shattering, but I wish that we would have gotten another look at this warband and see what happened to them after the events of Space Marine. Personally, 40k has a habit of making these one-off Chaos warbands and then doing absolutely nothing with them after some promotional thing. That being said, all in all, Warhammer 40,000 Bolt Gun was a surprising game in the fact that it was not just a decent 40k game, but hell, even a great boomer shooter in its own right, and I would handily recommend it to anyone that is looking to enjoy another shooter in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. You can grab Bolt Gun for the price of €15 or about $20 Canadian, and at that price I think it's an easy buy, especially for fans of boomer shooters or Warhammer 40,000. Well, that's one Warhammer game down on our list, and there maybe, just maybe, might be another one, so who knows, you gotta stay tuned for that one. But with that, let's leave and head on to number 7.
Number 7.
Humanity has always hunted for knowledge in the unknown. The wonder is, not that the field of stars is so vast, but that we have measured it. We're all here because we're committed to the biggest question of all. What's out there?
Yeah. Okay. I know I'm gonna get a lot of crap for this, but despite all its flaws, I really enjoyed Starfield, which is the latest large-scale RPG from Bethesda Game Studios, and the first new IP for Bethesda in over 25 years. So, let me justify the seemingly unjustifiable. Starfield takes place several centuries in the future where you, as a former miner, ended up touching an artifact Mass Effect style, and now you have to wander the galaxy to figure out the mystery of everything. Starfield is a very divisive release that got a lot of people with a lot of opinions, some of them really bad, especially since they haven't really played it, but despite all that and despite all the people whining online, I really did enjoy Starfield, and most of it came down to the narrative. But before we get to that, let's talk about the gameplay first. Starfield's gameplay is basically as shrimple as Fallout in space. You create an RPG character with a bunch of characteristics and traits that defines them, and then you are thrust into the galaxy to do, well, as you please. One of the largest changes is that they have added ships that the players can create, customize, and in certain cases steal from other NPCs. And while we don't think of Bethesda Game Studios as a vehicular-based developer, I think they've done a good job with the ships when it comes to the handling, combat, and the customization. On foot, you have a selection of firearms, energy weapons, and some other caseless stuff that gives a decent enough variety of weapons to use. But I will admit, by the end it might seem a little short on variety since you'll see all the weapons that there are about maybe halfway through the game, though this will surely be fixed with mods in the future. In essence, the gameplay loop of Starfield is getting a quest, going onto your ship, jumping to another system, and then when you're there either fighting space pirates in space or going down to the planet and solving a quest in a variety of different ways that ultimately are all kind of interesting. Main gripe that people are going to have compared to the other Bethesda Game Studios games is that the exploration they are used to isn't there, and for those that are looking for a very Skyrim or Fallout experience, I will admit they're probably not going to find it in Starfield. There's no going into the unknown and finding some random cave and getting a quest for it that leads you on a storied trail. Since space is so vast and in this case procedurally generated, that you won't really be finding any quests by landing on random planets. On the other hand, Starfield's questing starts at the hubs such as New Atlantis, Neon, and Aquila City, and goes out to different locations like the sort of old school airport hub and spoke system, where you have these main hubs where you will go to get most of your quests and then they will take you to where the content is. If you were more of a fan of how Bethesda Game Studios were then, you might find some issues with the new way to explore, since you'll mostly be coming across procedurally generated drivel instead of the more handcrafted drivel that you might expect from Bethesda Game Studios. Though, they make up for it with new mechanics like space combat. A big part of the gameplay that comes around every so often is, of course, the space combat, and with it the ships that you can customize and come in a whole new slew of parts from different manufacturers so you can create to your heart's content. Lastly, there's also the outpost mechanics that were taken from Fallout 4 and then expanded greatly to the point that you can connect different outposts to start a little economy and have them trade between the other outposts that you have set up and have the miners do what they do best. Outposts admittedly are the area I had the least amount of time in, but from the disappointment that the mechanics left me in Fallout 4, Starfield's outposts have quality of life improvements and more interconnectivity to make them at least more interesting for me. And of course there's way more to talk about with the gameplay, but to conclude in this regard so this video isn't 3 hours long, I'll say that all the systems that have been put into work are decent enough to get you through the game. Sure, it ain't gonna be Doom or Wing Commander or Cyberpunk, but it's not trying to be those games, it's trying to be its own thing. Usually we talk about the narrative in here, but since the narrative is the thing I enjoyed the most, we'll leave that for a little bit later. So in that stead, let's talk about the presentation of Starfield, both the good and the bad. Now, okay fellas, let's not beat around the bush, and I'm just gonna say that this is Bethesda Game Studios game. So in presentation wise, these games usually look butt ugly. But in the case of Starfield, there's some things that are gonna look okay, some things that actually look kinda decent, and many things that are just downright hideous. Of course, for those unawares, I am talking about the butt-ugly NPC models, most of them being procedurally generated random NPCs that you see in the cities that honestly just kinda look like average Americans these days. Though I will say that the models for the main characters are perfectly serviceable in my opinion. And a lot of the other models for things such as weapons, ships, and some of the typical technological design might not look the best graphically, but in my opinion it is elevated quite a bit by the design philosophy which Bethesda Game Studios has dubbed NASA Punk. For the design philosophy in NASA Punk, it's basically taking the rugged, serviceable, and utilitarian design of current spacefaring vessels that we see today, with thick, clacky keyboards and indestructible screens that seem to come from half a century ago, and then you basically extrapolate that a couple centuries in the future, and then you see what we get. I also really like that all the companies for all the vessels, buildings, and equipment have their own design styles and philosophies. So for example, firearms of the freedom-loving Freestar Collective have wood stocks and 6-shooters on them, while the United Colonies has more stereotypical cubic design for their stuff. Though above all else that props up the presentation for Starfield has to be Enon Zur's soundtrack that is quite extensive and for the most part gets you into the mood to explore the cosmos and see what is out there. One particular track that was just stuck in my head for ages and ages was the Starfield theme that shows up from time to time in its own right. But for the most part, you're going to hear it as this sort of victorious fanfare whenever you level up that always got me pumped whenever I heard it and made the game just that much more enjoyable to play because you wanted to see where the adventure would take you. Next, we're going to move on to the one area that caught my attention completely for Starfield, and that is the narrative, because man oh man, it surprised and delighted me. To highlight why I enjoyed Starfield's narrative so much, especially compared to the last two Bethesda games that came out, those being of course Fallout 4 and Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, is that Starfield is in a completely new world and IP with its own lore and stories to discover for the first time. When it comes to Elder Scrolls and Fallout, I've kind of been playing them for so long that you know every dumb little bit of lore and most of the plot details, so it feels at least that there's nothing really new to discover apart from whatever quests they have to offer, and for the last two games, they have been caught lacking in my opinion. Starfield, on the other hand, is all fresh and new. Like the astronauts landing on the moon for the first time, this was a brand new step to see what was out there. And while I don't think it should win any awards, the lore and the stories that Starfield has to offer kept my attention. Whether it's figuring out the mysterious circumstances of mankind's departure from the Earth, or picking up the pieces of two factions of human space after a terrible galactic war, or figuring out the origins of the most deadly galactic predator known to the settled systems, it was all just honestly really incredibly interesting to uncover. And in one aspect that Bethesda surprised and delighted me was with the main questline and the surrounding companions that I genuinely believe is not just the best questline that Bethesda has ever done, but some of the best companions that you could have in a Bethesda game period. I don't know why, but the caliber of the writing when it came to Constellation, which is one of the main factions of Starfield, and their goal of finding out the truths of the universe and just what exactly is out there in the Starfield kept my attention and had me want to dig in deeper. I particularly enjoy that you can spin the themes of the main quest into a secular one, a scientist trying to figure out the secrets of the universe, or if you did it like I did, where the main quest almost becomes like a search for God, and the fact that you could spin it both ways, and both are just as valid, is pretty incredible to me. And the companions that you pick from in Constellation in your travels are some of the best that Bethesda has done, whether it be the current leader of Constellation, Sarah, the ever-chill vagabond Barrett, the literal space cowboy descendant from a storied lineage Sam Coe, or my favorite being the secretive and elusive Andrea, that has many things to spill the beans on once you get to know her. I particularly enjoy that your companions have opinions of their own that don't seem to be as shallow as good or bad. There's many times where there's a decision that needs to be made and they weigh up the options with you and they recognize that most of the time it's just not so black and white. Sometimes you can even have your companions speak for you in certain circumstances, such as when they have a moral quandary to ponder on, or they might have some experience with the faction that you're speaking with. And believe me, there's many factions and whole faction quest lines for you to dabble in, ranging from the bioweapon race against time with the UC Vanguard, using your sly corporate skills and dirty hands to climb to the top of the corporate ladder at Ryujin, or helping the Crimson Fleet find ghosts from 100 years ago so they can become the most powerful corsairs of the stars, or perhaps even help UC Fleet Command by being a double agent. While it's not limitless, there's a whole lot to see, and most of it was honestly incredibly interesting to me. So that's the gist of what I gotta say with Starfield. Sure, it's not a perfect game, but man, like, after all the hours that I spent with it, I came out pretty pleased, so that's all you can say sometimes. I apologize for the audience because I'm gonna hop on my soapbox, but personally I kinda think that the discourse online with this game is a bit disingenuous. At this point in time, honestly, everybody knows whether Bethesda is for them or not, and people pretending that they're giving it a fair shot only to crap on it is a bit absurd and disingenuous. There's a lot of flaws to point at with Starfield, but some people seem to be hung up on the bad faith arguments over games that are not even like it at all. A lot of them, which I've heard all year with any RPG, is the comparison with Baldur's Gate 3, which to me is absurd because Starfield is an FPS RPG hybrid in the stars, and the other is a CRPG, computer RPG, set in the world of Face Slop that caters to theater kids. But I'll leave it at that before I get ripped to shreds because people will already hate me for putting this game on the list and not Baldur's Gate 3. Though, if you want to be not disingenuous and not a bad faith actor when you make your criticisms, then you can pick up Starfield at full price on PC and Xbox, or you could try it as part of your Game Pass subscription if you subscribe to that. So with that, we're gonna leave Starfield behind, and hopefully the next game on our list isn't quite as controversial, because if it is, these people are gonna kill me. So with that, let's get on to number 6.
Number 6.
Coming in at number 6 is a game that I've already covered, but I still love as much now as I did back then, and that is the incredible Italian infamy known as Pizza Tower, which is the debut game from developers Tour de Pizza. In Pizza Tower, you play the role of a humble pizzaiolo known as Peppino that has to scale the eponymous Pizza Tower to get to the top and defeat the evil Pizza Face in order to save his floundering pizzeria. Ho ho ho, fellas, you gotta get all your toppings out, put on your nicest chef hat, and grow out that bushy mustache because Pizza Tower is going to throw you through a platforming romp so fun that it's going to have you singing Furiculi Furicula for numerous days to come. Well, fellas, since I basically explained the plot of the game in the intro, I'm just going to kind of move up ahead into the gameplay, which is actually the main portion of Pizza Tower that is to be concerned. Though I have one final word on the narrative, if you could say that, is that you're basically going to meet a whole bunch of cool characters. Now, the gameplay concept of Pizza Tower is actually really basic, but really novel. Essentially, you'll be going through individual levels, trying not to get hit by enemies, and saving as many toppings as you can along the way. Perhaps even finding a couple of secrets in the level while you're at it. What makes traversing through the level a joy to do is this dash mechanic where Peppino will start a dash and over time increase that to a run, and eventually a sound barrier crashing sprint that will have you rushing through entire screens in seconds. The key is to not get hit along the way so you don't acquire damage and in turn lower the final score that you will get at the end of the level, because what we're really vying for is that elusive P rank or pizza rank, which is a rank above S rank that can only be attained by Italians themselves. So if you ain't a paisano, don't even think of attempting it. Now, even for people of pura sangue like myself have some trouble getting that elusive P rank. So if you don't get it, don't worry about it, fellas, because sometimes it just ain't meant to be. The big mechanic in all of this is when you reach the end of a level, usually at blazing speeds that makes it difficult to stop or even note what you have done, and you'll come across a big purple block that if you destroy it, it will activate pizza time, and a countdown will occur where you have to make an even madder dash all the way through the level backwards in order to not get destroyed by Pizza Face. Pizza time is the magic sauce that ties the whole game together, and across all the levels you'll be having a riot thinking you just barely got through some sections, only for the game to give you that whammy of having to do it all over again, backwards, and this time, of course, with the time limit. What's more is that each individual level will have a specific mechanic that changes things up a bit, whether it be wearing a suit of armor where when you dash you can only change directions while falling, or turning into a ghost that completely changes the speed and angle of traversal. And one of my favorite being a level where you start with a timer and you have to defuse bombs all along the level in order to not get blown up. You add all those elements together and Pizza Tower ends up being one of the most fun and innovative platformers that I've played in years that will have you smiling the whole way while you're trying to get away from Pizza Face. The one element that ties all of Pizza Tower together is its aesthetic and presentation, because man oh man, this is a little slice of the 90s that's just something special. To say from the beginning, if you're not a fan of the incredible stereotype of the Italian-American pizzaiolo who's fat, hairy, and got a pencil, or even better, a big bushy mustache, serving a big slice of the greasiest pizza you have ever seen while the tunes of Funiculi Funicula play in the background, then you might not enjoy the particularly cheesy, no pun intended, aesthetic that Pizza Tower is going for. On a visual end, the game is taking the overreactive, expressive animation of the 90s and wonderfully rendering it down to mere pixels with the same movement and effect. Whether it be Peppino screaming with his eyes popping out or doing the taunt button that will shuffle Peppino through different goofy poses. My favorite of course being the Zoot Suit Daffy Duck reaching out towards the player. There's clearly a love towards the art of animation and a dedication towards a period that we all feel a little nostalgic for, no matter how old we are. You can then take that soundtrack that is like a collection of your favorite 90s songs that never existed, with goofy samples and all that, but the mood and themes for all these tracks range from all over the place. Take for instance the tutorial track known as Funiculi Holiday, which is a slowed down, more chill rendition of the ever lovable Funiculi Funicula, that will teach you the mechanics of the game at a pace that is comfortable to the player while still giving a little bit of that Italian style. Then you get other tracks like Pizza Time that play during, well, Pizza Time, where you have to race all the way back to the beginning, and it does a great job at really heightening the tension to make you want to haul ass out of there before Pizza Face gets you. Lastly, one even more wild and tense track that I'll talk about is Thousand March. That is like Pizza Time, but you crank that up to 11 by having the song blaring in your headphones as if it was a Perturbator or Carpenter Brut track, while you're rushing through the war zone trying to disarm bombs and get those precious seconds of time before the ensuing war consumes you like a nice slice of pizza. Fellas, I could talk endlessly about the Pizza Tower soundtrack, and I honestly think it's some of the best of 2023, though there's some other ones that might give it a run for its money, but we gotta hurry this stuff along because we're not even in the top 5 yet. Ultimately, Pizza Tower was a platformer that I had a huge blast playing through last year. It's got really cool, refreshing gameplay, silly characters, and a groovy aesthetic that will just stick with you for a long while after the game is done. Currently, you can only find Pizza Tower on PC, though I believe that will change in the future. You can pick it up on itch.io or Steam for just around €20 or $22 Canadian, and at that price you're gonna have a great time. And while Pizza Tower is one of the freshest slices that I've had this year, it still didn't meet the top 5, and we're gonna head on to the top 5 now, which is where the cream of the crop is. And if you don't know, fellas, usually in other years, the top 3 or something like that, those are the ones that is like, any of these could be Game of the Year. But honestly, at top 5 here for 2023, any of these games could have been Game of the Year in their own year. But oh boy, there can only be one. So let's head on to number 5.
Number 5.
The rogue trader has fallen. Now I must take up their mantle to restore the dynasty to its former glory, to reclaim what humanity has lost, to venture forth into darkness and bring the light of the Emperor to the uncharted void.
Hey, and like I said, we're a couple places down on the list, and we have the second and final Warhammer game, and that is going to be Owlcat's latest CRPG romp in Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader. Rogue Trader places you in the role of a Lord Captain of a Rogue Trader house. Rogue traders basically being captains of spaceships in Warhammer 40k that can do basically whatever they want because they got a nice little thing signed by the Emperor himself saying, hey, I can do anything that I want. You do everything that you want within the Coronis expanse of the Calixis sector, which for not so old heads out there was Fantasy Flight Games' chunk of the Warhammer 40k universe that they set their tabletop RPGs in. As a Lord Captain, you'll be tasked with managing the affairs of House von Valancius, which will have you towing the line between the righteous order of the Imperium or perhaps the quick gain by making allegiances with dark powers. And it's up to the Lord Captain to figure out which path has a higher profit factor. Rogue Trader isn't Owlcat's first foray into CRPGs because they've also done the Pathfinder games, specifically Kingmaker and Wrath of the Righteous, but for fellas out there that are getting out of Baldur's Gate 3 or other CRPGs for the first time, this one is kind of nice because it's not as obtuse as those games, because Rogue Trader, it's a little bit shorter. Now, while I did explain it a little bit in Space Wreck, I am going to explain a little bit further what a computer role-playing game is, and it's taking the rules and sometimes the perspectives of tabletop RPG games and crunching it down for a computer. So instead of a game master telling you what's going on and how the events are unfolding, it's a pre-made campaign determined by the developers, and in the case of Rogue Trader, it actually uses a bit more than just the Coronis Expanse as a setting from Fantasy Flight Games. In fact, the entire rule set for Rogue Trader comes from the tabletop role-playing games set in the Warhammer 40,000 universe that FFG, Fantasy Flight Games, made about a decade ago, which range from Dark Heresy, which puts you into the retinue of an Inquisitor, to Rogue Trader, where you play the role of the acolytes of an illustrious Rogue Trader house, or you can even play Black Crusade, where you make your own Chaos Space Marines and wreak havoc on the followers of the Corpse Emperor. Basically what this means is that it uses the rule set provided in those games to create your character and manage how they interact with the world. And in doing so, you can create a variety of characters, like coming from a Death world, an Adeptus Mechanicus Forge world, be a part of the Imperial Navy, or an Underhiver gang or piece of scum, or even originating from more mysterious circumstances. From there, a retinue of characters ranging from a Sister of Battle from the battle-hardened Adepta Sororitas, a mind-bending unsanctioned psyker, to even the creepy as shit pompous sweetheart that is the ship's resident navigator. Or if you were to look her in the eyes, especially the third one, you'll die from exposure to the warp, and you and your friends get out of the ship and they go on adventures. These adventures range from helping a planetary governor solve a local revolt to make sure the supply of grain continues to the rest of the expanse, or trying to solve a mystery concerning the Ward Bearer's Legion of Heretic Astartes. In these missions, the challenges you'll come across will be either combat-oriented, which usually has my Lord Captain melting somebody with an overcharged shot from his plasma gun, to more puzzle or narrative-oriented ones like getting the resident Adeptus Mechanicus Magos to solve a computer problem. Either way, like the Pathfinder games, there's a wide variety of ways that you can tackle your adventures, which can have you be a wonderfully dogmatic prude, an iconoclastic do-gooder, or even a hand-rubbingly evil heretic who plots nothing but the downfall of mankind for the whims of dark gods. But a lot of the times, it's not how you do things, but why you do things. And I gotta say, fellas, that the narrative for Rogue Trader, even for Sternguard veterans of the 41st millennium, or recent neophytes, you're gonna find something that you're gonna love in this game. The gist of the events that kick off Rogue Trader, without explaining too much, is that you are one of the many gene descendants of the Rogue Trader house of von Valancius, and your patron, Theodora von Valancius, has brought you on board her familial void ship to see if you're worthy being her heir. This is an important thing because Rogue Traders are bearers of a warrant handed from the time where the Master of Mankind walked amongst men, to go out into space and through hook or by crook bring human civilizations and worlds into the Imperium. So anyone with the warrant has carte blanche to do as they please, though within reasons within the bounds outside of Imperial space. So if they need to deal with Xenos races, then they have that right to do that. Anyway, events ensue and you are left with full control of the warrant and become the Lord Captain of the ship, and with that you need to figure out how you were betrayed from within and get the messy situation you find yourself in under control. For those that are really new to 40k, they'll really enjoy Rogue Trader since I think it has some of the best introductions to the universe, especially when it comes to showcasing concepts like warp travel, navigators, the various human factions, and so on. Sure, it's not going to perfectly sum up the events of the Horus Heresy or anything like that, but it'll do an incredible job in getting the uninitiated into the fold. Of particular that I really enjoy are the characters that make up your retinue, such as Argenta, who's a battle sister looking for a holy relic of her order, the aged Abelard that helped your predecessor through trials and tribulations. Then there's the local Lord Inquisitor's interrogator, Heinrich van Kylox, who's always out to see the worst in others because, well, that's part of his job. And my favorite being the pale, lanky, and pompous shut-in waifu of Cassia, who's a navigator who's never really left her home space station before you brought her into your retinue. There's of course many more companions and characters to deal with, and they run the gambit of what you can see in the 41st millennium. From members of the venerable Adeptus Astartes to the elusive and mysterious Eldar, and perhaps their even more cruel and conniving cousins, the Dark Eldar. And for the audience out there in Games Workshop, no, I'm not gonna say Eldari or Drukari. Sorry, I'm too old school for this. The sort of stories that you'll find yourself in can be as simple as meeting the workers in the bowels of your ship that are complaining about the environment and the hazards, to trying to get to the bottom of a sector-wide chaos cult that could be a terrible enemy or a valuable ally. And of course, there's many more quests that can end with you ordering the summary execution of some poor fools, which is wonderful. My only real gripe with the narrative is that sometimes it goes a little too hard in assuming that you know nothing about the world of 40k. For instance, I made a Lord Captain that had previously been an officer in the Imperial Navy. So you would think he would know what a navigator is, since he might have seen a warp jump or two serving on a ship, but it's a bit strange to see dialogue asking you like, hey, what's a navigator? Apart from that, I really don't have any narrative gripes with Rogue Trader. It's a lot of bog standard 40k stuff, but for the first time showcased in a new form that is really cool, and it held my attention right till the end. I guess kind of to wrap up this little section of the top 10, I'll talk about the presentation of Rogue Trader because, man, it's not really a whole lot to talk about, but what is there is pretty decent. Basically, Rogue Trader is like any other bog standard CRPG where you got the camera pulled back, and for the most part you will see the game from this perspective. Now, I will say that if there's one thing that the infamously overrated, in my opinion, Baldur's Gate 3 did incredibly well, apart from the gameplay of course, is that the presentation in that game blows most RPGs out of the water when it comes to the cutscenes, fully spoken dialogue, even though everyone has a nasty British accent negating that, and just generally in comparison to other CRPGs, it just looks better. Rogue Trader can't compete in that regard, but how it does compete is by taking the unique style and aesthetic of Warhammer and expanding it to an incredible array of places and environments that we don't typically get to see, like the inside of void ships, Angra worlds, inside the house of the Navis Nobilitae, and many, many more. I will also highlight some of the portraits that you can choose for your characters in Rogue Trader that are just incredible. My favorite, of course, being the one that I chose for my Lord Captain that's literally just Tom but in 40k. But ultimately, I really enjoyed Rogue Trader. It's something that's a lot different than the Pathfinder games that they've made. It's not quite as obtuse as those games, and it's a lot more manageable for people who are, already fans of CRPGs or people that are getting into it new. And honestly as well, it's a 40k game, so oh boy, I ate that stuff up. While Rogue Trader is not going to win the awards or the prestige that Baldur's Gate 3 is getting, personally, I think it was the best CRPG of 2023, and I can't wait to see if Owlcat does another CRPG in the 40k universe. Personally, I would love to see one done in the style of Dark Heresy, where it's all about the Inquisition and all the antics that they get up to. You can grab this game amazingly enough on all consoles and of course on PC for the price of €50 or $65 Canadian, which for being a CRPG that will possibly take you dozens of hours to complete means that it's a pretty fair price in my book. But of course, that's the end of number 5. Now we gotta get into number 4. So let's get into it.
Number 4.
Yep, that's me. And you're probably wondering how I ended up here. Well, it's pretty standard. Check this out. Music player in my chest. It's powering up my new robot arm. Whoa. It's making everything sync up with the beat. Let's rock. This is awesome! Vandalay Technologies isn't just coming from my arm. They're after all of us.
That's the defect! What in the hell am I looking at?
The name's Chai, not Defect.
Is this the guy?
Hey, another video that I actually did this year, and at number 4 we have the surprising and exquisite shadow drop from Tango Gameworks out of Japan, known as Hi-Fi Rush. Hi-Fi Rush has us in the punkster-ass shoes of Chai, a wannabe rocker that has been chosen to be a human guinea pig and human augmentation for the Vandalay Corporation, so he can get a new arm and be the rock star that he's always wanted to be. Sadly for Vandalay, and not so sadly for Chai, his MP3 player somehow got sneaked in with his new biomechanical heart, and for some reason he now sees the rhythm of the world and everything he does will be done to the beat. This is one of those games that you think you got your list made up for the year and what you think is going to be the greats, and then stuff like Hi-Fi Rush pops out of literally nowhere to give you an exquisite surprise. This is another one that I'm going to be kind of brief because I've already done a video on it, but needless to say, oh boy, I absolutely loved Hi-Fi Rush. Basically, in Hi-Fi Rush, you have the gang of Chai and Peppermint, who's a techie hacker with her robot cat 808, who go against the full might of Vandalay and its tireless legion of robots, and of course, the board of directors, all the way from quality assurance that goes up to the CEO himself, K.O. Vandalay. While it's not the greatest of the greats when it comes to its plot and its story, Hi-Fi Rush gets the job done by having a cast of lovable characters that are fun to cheer on, or, fun to poo-poo on as if they were a wrestling heel, which in the case of one of the board is more real than you might think. Humor is not quite childish, but definitely meant for more audiences, so it has that tones and jokes that come across almost like a Saturday morning cartoon, which when matched with the visuals seems very plausible that it might just be spun off in that regard. Some of my favorite characters in Hi-Fi Rush are the lovable buffoon Chai, who thinks he's the hottest shit until he gets stomped on by a giant robot, the ever-helpful Cinnamon, who's a reprogrammed Vandalay robot that draws with marker on his face all the emotions that he's feeling. Though my favorite characters in the game might be a duo of robot investigators that are very clearly Sebastian Castellanos and Joseph Oda, from one of Tango Gameworks' other games and The Evil Within, a friggin' survival horror game of all things, which has some hints that there might be a third installment in this game. And what's wild is that all of this was done by a studio that previously was known for survival horror, but here they come, spin that thing around, and they've made a character action game, as the kids say these days, and oh man, the gameplay for it is awesome. If it wasn't immediately obvious by now, what Hi-Fi Rush does, and does incredibly well, is taking the elements of action games, or character action, like some people like to say these days, which are games like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, and then you add in the rhythm elements to everything. What this means is that there's a sort of beat that's reflected in everything, from the enemies, the environment, and how Chai does his attacks, to where everything you do is on the beat. Take for instance attacking. This isn't like the other games mentioned where you're strategically slamming your thumbs on the buttons as fast as you can. This game actually rewards you for a bit of restraint in getting you to hit the buttons at the beat of the track that's playing in the background. Now this doesn't mean that you can't just brute force your way through it, but I assure you that if you take the time to take the rhythm into consideration, you will get great results like stronger attacks, more damage on every hit, and best of all, that S rank at the end of a fight. This is also reflected on the enemies, where they will follow the same rules, attacking on the beat and choreographing devastating attacks to the beat of everything around you. Hell, some of the best sequences are moments where you have to dodge and parry a big attack and the whole move is literally shown to you, and if you dodge and parry at the same beat, you'll perfect it. This seemingly simple but novel mechanic changes everything about these types of action games that Hi-Fi Rush has become such a breath of fresh air. Not necessarily that I get sick of those types of games, but playing a game with the music being such an integral part of the experience was just wonderful. Oh boy, and you fellas, you know me. You know I gotta love the soundtrack, so of course, let's talk about the soundtrack and the presentation as a whole, because oh boy, Hi-Fi Rush is just wonderful in that regard. Firstly, the sort of cel-shaded style of the characters in the world do a lot in bundling this thing into a fun package that needs to be experienced, but this time you play it instead of just watching it on your Saturday morning TV with a bowl of Reese's Puffs in your hand. The characters are cartoonish and expressive without going a little too overboard, like I've seen with a lot of animations lately that just make me want to leave the figurative theater. But that doesn't mean that there isn't room for a lot of jokes, ranging from simple slapstick to one of my favorite short ones being Rekka popping out of her dialogue box to flick a drone out of Chai's hand. But the real star of the show is the amazing sound design and soundtrack that takes us from a pretty decent 7 to what would be, in my humble opinion, one of the best games of this year. Of particular note that I really enjoyed was the exquisite use of licensed music, ranging from 9 Inch Nails' The Perfect Drug, The Prodigy's Invaders Must Die, and a particularly incredible sequence near the end of the game that wraps everything up into a nice bow with The Joy Formidable's Whirring playing in the background. There's even some license-free music that Tango developed for the game, and those tracks work just as well, but they might not have the same effect as listening to some of the beloved tracks that we already know. But enough of that. There hasn't been one of these in this entire list, so let's let the game do the talking and let's see what the music's all about.
Ready for this?
This is entertaining. Let's raise the stakes and turn down the lights.
You got this back. Got a roll on my sleeve.
Man, even editing this section of the video right now is making me want to pick up the controller and go back to playing Hi-Fi Rush, because it was an absolute pleasure to play, and man, I can't wait to see what Tango Gameworks does next. Man, there's so many different opportunities and genres that this game can go in a future installment that it can make your head spin. One of my favorite ideas currently floating in my head is having a level where Chai's heart gets hit by something nasty, and you have to play the rest of the level on something that's not a typical rhythm, like having some prog metal like Between the Buried and Me or Tesseract taking you to wild places. So with that, Hi-Fi Rush can be found currently on Xbox Series consoles and PC, though by the time this video comes out, there is probably a huge chance that it's on Switch and PS5 as well. You can get all of those for the nice humble price of €30 or $40 Canadian, but since this is an Xbox game, you can also grab this game as part of your Game Pass subscription. If you want to know more about Hi-Fi Rush, then you can go take a look at the video that I made. I'll put it down in the description for you guys to enjoy there. But with that, let's head on over to number 3.
Number 3.
Deep Sea 15. What is this place?
Who cares? Let's figure out if it's empty, claim the title, and get out of here.
Hello, I am Moses. What is your name?
Moses found another body.
Getting a really bad feeling here.
Just a little further.
Rig this size, it'd be a big crew. What happened?
What if they're stuck below?
Underwater? Wouldn't last long under pressure like that.
Depends on what's down there.
What in hell?
Have you ever?
No. Never.
finally stumbling our way to the final 3 where the cream of the crop is, or in the case for 2023, where the cream of the cream of the cream of the crop is. And at number 3 we have the Brotherhood's latest sci-fi horror point-and-click adventure goodness in Stasis Bone Totem. Stasis Bone Totem is a sequel to 2015's Stasis and 2017's Kane. Bone Totem takes place several centuries in the future and follows the lives of our salvagers Mac, Charlie, and the very smart bear super toy Moses, as they go through salvaging an abandoned offshore station of Deep Sea 15 belonging to the Kane Corporation. So with that, it's up to our unlikely trio to go through the Kane facility and uncover just what Kane sought below the seas and what the nasty corporation tried to seal away, without the gang having to suffer through what was meant to be undiscovered in the full malevolence of the largest corporation in human civilization. Man, Stasis Bone Totem kinda caught me off guard because it was one of those games where it was like, man, they made a sequel to Stasis? Because I didn't really know until somebody told me, and then when I ended up playing it, it went all the way up on my list. And so, let's talk about why I love this game so much. Usually I touch on the narrative first, but since the narrative is the element of Bone Totem that I enjoyed the most, we'll go over the gameplay first since it's relatively simple, but it actually makes for some interesting changes from the norm. Bone Totem, like Stasis before it, and a long, bespoke line of adventure games before Stasis, is what we like to call a point-and-click adventure game, in the sense that you click around a screen for objects and devices to use and the character that you control interacts with it. This could be something like using a piece of a pipe to pry open a door to get into the door and find an item inside, or to get Moses to put a skin sample on an automatic turret to shoot an elevator and continue with his quest. What makes Bone Totem a bit different is the shared quantum storage device, which is basically a clever way to explain how people can hold so many items without being obviously encumbered. This device was found in the first Stasis, but this time around there's a neat little twist. This go around we play 3 different characters and they all can do their own special actions. For instance, Mac has a biotic arm which he can use to separate, bend, or otherwise dismantle various objects. And then, when in the quantum storage device, Charlie, who's an engineer, can put several items together to make a brand new item for then Moses to use in a puzzle that he's stuck on. Might seem really obtuse from a glance, but the objects are pretty obvious and you can use right click to ping all the items that you can look at, pick up, or otherwise make a comment on, which could lead to Charlie finding a piece of a bent pipe, for Mac to unbend the pipe into a flat bar, and for then Moses to use that to open a door. The level of moon logic, as they call it in this genre, basically puzzles that are so ridiculously obtuse that it would require being initiated in esoteric knowledge to figure out, is actually really manageable in Bone Totem. You're not going to be sitting around for ages looking for a single pixel to continue the story and figure out what you have to do. But what's more interesting is that with these 3 characters, they'll spend a majority of the game apart from each other. So it means that each character is in their own little interesting environment. Mac could be looking through mechanical shops, while Moses is saying hello to a Kane Corp hologram out in the welcome hall. And in the meantime, Charlie is dealing with the biomechanical hell of trying to get the malfunctioning diving suit working. To me, it really helped in keeping the game refreshing and paced incredibly well, where you're not in one single environment for a ridiculous amount of time, and if you are and you get stuck, then you could just switch to another character and try to figure out to see if they can solve the problem from that different perspective. Not to mention the vast amount of environments that you will encounter are staggering for a point-and-click adventure game. And while I don't want to spoil anything, I will say that it can run the gambit between industrial offshore platforms, undersea facilities, and the worst kind of biomechanical goop you can imagine. Now, with the gameplay out of the way, let's go on and talk about the presentation, because I want to talk about the narrative a bit later, but with the presentation, sure, it's not your PlayStation movie game quality of presentation, but for a point-and-click adventure game, I think it does a pretty good job. Unlike the first Stasis, which was made up of 2D sprites of 3D models then placed on a 2D background, which is kind of like a weird way of doing things, but it ended up working really well. Bone Totem, on the other hand, seems to have jumped to the 3rd dimension. All the models for characters like Charlie, Mac, and Moses are 3D models, and while most of the environments are 2D, they are easy enough to traverse that you don't really know the difference. What sets everything apart are the environments and the design, because it's both familiar and unfamiliar in the most horrifying of ways. For instance, for a game set several centuries in the future, most of the technology seems rather rudimentary. Then you're tasked with figuring out how to repair a diving suit, and you have to replace the mangled, rotting Aqualung TM by Kane Corporation, and it's reflected in how the characters behave, which is this sort of passiveness to showcase just how normal all this horrifying biomechanical stuff is. Then down the road, there's going to be some even more outlandish environments, but I don't want to spoil them, so I'm not going to say anything. But I am going to say, holy hell, does it get so much more worse than this. The soundtrack, on the other hand, while not being the most incredible thing, does have some highlights, prime of which is the fact that in different stages in the game, the tracks change depending on who you're currently controlling. It could have these haunting horns of Charlie's perseverance, the long full acoustic guitar of Mac's guilt, and the music box sounds and motifs of a smart toy that doesn't quite understand that the person he's introducing himself to is a dead body. Lastly, I'll kind of touch on some full motion cutscenes that sometimes can be a little hard to figure out on what's going on. What I can gather is that the Brotherhood really went above and beyond to try and make a more cinematic game, but sometimes their limitations show. But to be honest, it didn't really bother me that much. It just kind of comes across as amateur, which in the case for the Brotherhood it kind of is, but you know, nothing to worry about there. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the reason that this game is on the top 3, and that's because of its narrative. And oh boy, man, it's got themes of like tragedy, of living in a dystopic environment, but eventually it opens up to hope for a better future. To start off, I guess we should probably talk about the world that Bone Totem takes place in, because with no exaggeration, in full compliments to the Brotherhood, but I don't think I've seen a dystopia so awful that it gives me that gut reaction to stay away from it as far as I can. In this future that's ruled over by this ever-present Kane Corporation, it's in the realness that really gets me. Personally, I feel like a lot of other dystopic environments come across almost like a parody or a joke because of how comically evil the corporations or the government can be. Kane Corporation, on the other hand, is evil that we can see with the megacorps of today. Not in that they are evil, because, well, they are, but in the sort of real incompetence that these gigantic structures can get into. It's not so much that what these people are doing are morally ambiguous, because it's clearly evil, it's that in the world that is a biomechanical nightmare, where you have giant masses of flesh as biotic computers to run the facility, or where a simple worksite accident that requires augmentation to fix can put your family in indentured servitude on a distant moon, these things are just standard procedure for normal folks in this reality. So when you get to stuff that makes Charlie and Mac want to get the hell out of Deep Sea 15, it's much worse than you can possibly imagine. Because to us, this stuff is already grotesque and depressing, but that extra layer is just soul crushing. For instance, a really light inconsequential spoiler is that in this world, Old Man Kane, as they call him, basically came back from the dead and killed God, disproving the idea of heaven, and so only to implement the Nexus, which is a sort of virtual heaven allowed only to those with a transcendence chip that will back up their consciousness to the Nexus. As a Catholic, that concept alone would drive me to despair, but then you add on top reading messages between Kane Corp employees that go to the tune of, "Oh, don't worry about your wife's indentured servitude. She has been let go from her post. Hopefully you will be reunited with your wife in the Nexus." It's stuff like those messages that showcase just how awful this world is, and that it puts shivers down my spine. I've always said that the worst of the worst dystopias are the ones that make you feel thankful for the world that you are currently living in, because it can get so much more worse than you can possibly think. And to the Brotherhood, I say, bravo, you've created possibly one of the most bleak and horrific dystopias that I have ever seen. And guess what, fellas? What I just talked about, that's just the universe. We haven't even talked about the central characters of Charlie, Mac, and Moses. So, man, let's get into that, because it's gonna put a tear on your face. With all the things going horribly wrong in the universe that Stasis takes place in, at the heart of it all in Bone Totem is a tragic story of Charlie, Mac, and Moses just trying to survive another day in this rotten world. The game starts and bills are starting to accumulate for Charlie and Mac, with the promise of a good haul of salvage coming in from Deep Sea 15, potentially keeping them free for another year or so, before the universe gets the best of them. But for the likes of them, the world has already ended. Moses is a smart bear toy and was the best friend for Hope, which was Charlie and Mac's daughter. Keyword on was, because when Moses got swept out to sea one time, Hope went in after him to save him and drowned. Now, they are left a broken family. Mac feeling empty while doing everything he can to go to the next day, Charlie living every day with the guilt of having her daughter drown, and poor old Moses, left not understanding why Hope isn't around, but missing her all the same.
I miss Hope, Charlie.
I do too.
I miss playing with her.
I do too.
Is it wrong to wish I could stop missing her? Sometimes I feel guilty for wishing it.
No, I think that, it isn't wrong at all.
My Charlie.
Without spoiling it, going through Bone Totem and having to see that even with all the evil that the world has thrown at our unlikely trio, that they find ways to persevere through the darkness. While various characters along the way have resigned themselves to the fate that has befallen them, Charlie, Mac, and Moses in one way or another refuse to become slaves to darkness, and learn to live with grief, which, as a great man once said, that grief is the final and most painful and purest expression of love, and that's a great way to explain what Bone Totem is all about. Who would have told me that I would be tearing up at seeing the story of essentially a semi-sentient teddy bear learn to let go of the fear of water at the start of 2023? I would not have believed you, but needless to say, the narrative that Stasis Bone Totem takes you through left me with sniffles all along the way. And that's without even letting you know about all the wilder, more horrific stuff that is left in store for you, since I don't really want to spoil anything for the narrative. And in the end, Bone Totem was single-handedly the best adventure game of 2023. And one of the best narrative experiences of the year. And if you're looking for a horror fix with a nice tinge of the dystopic, then you would be well suited to pick up a copy. You can pick up Stasis Bone Totem on Steam or GOG for around €20 or about $25 Canadian, which is an incredible price for such a touching experience. But if you're looking to grab it on consoles, then you wouldn't have to wait too long, since it should be also coming to Xbox, PlayStation, and Nintendo Switch. Though if you are worried on whether or not you need to have played Stasis or Kane to enjoy Bone Totem, then let me be clear in saying that you don't really need to. I would suggest though that you play through Stasis, since I think it's great, but I would skip Kane all the same because that one's just not that good. Ooh-wee. So that's number 3 out of the way. And at this point, fellas, if you know me, you probably know what the next 2 games are going to be. But with that, we leave Bone Totem behind and we get on to our top 2. So with that, let's head on to number 2.
Number 2.
You were only a child when they sent you off to war. Now look at you. The weight of a galaxy on your shoulders.
Didn't I tell you to be more careful about who you scan? Come on.
I cannot tell you who you must become, or where the line is drawn. There are no easy choices. These are dark times. We have few allies.
Good to see you, Cal.
Hey, it's not even been that long, but boy howdy, here we are with the latest installment of Respawn's Jedi series, and man oh man, Star Wars Jedi Survivor was a friggin' treat. Star Wars Jedi Survivor takes place 5 years after the events of Fallen Order and follows Count Kestis in his fight against the Empire, while simultaneously trying to find a way to hide from them once and for all. After an unfortunate mission gone wrong on Coruscant, Cal, his trusty droid buddy BD-1, and newcomer Bo Dakuna must go to Kobo to try and get the former band together, following a trail of intrigue that sets him on the path against the nefarious Galactic Empire, the local pirate gang known as the Bedlam Raiders, and perhaps some enemies out of time itself. In these dark times where the Empire has consolidated its control over the galaxy, will our lovable heroes make it to the end? Will Cal learn to grip with the losses that he's incurred and make a new home for himself and perhaps other lost Jedi out there, or will they all be left in darkness? It is one of those games that if you knew me, you were probably waiting for me to put it on this list. And honestly, now that I have Star Wars Jedi Survivor on number 2, you probably know what the game of the year is, but whatever. Oh man, there is so much to talk about Jedi Survivor. And so with that, let's talk about the gameplay and how it perfected the foundations that were set up in Fallen Order. Jedi Survivor, like its predecessor, is what the kids these days like to call a Souls-like, which is basically any sort of game fashioning itself from Software's games like Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and most recently Elden Ring. What ones mean by this is that Cal traverses the world with BD, and he's cutting, stabbing, and slashing people with the lightsaber, while BD occasionally gives Cal some health stims to heal himself in the thick of combat. Eventually, you're going to come across a meditation point where you can heal, refill your stim packs, and level up Cal's ability in the many forms of lightsaber combat. The issue is that once you meditate, the enemies will respawn as well, making you really want to plot out how you go about making your way through the map. The Souls games are basically of this style, but the two big takeaways that make Jedi Survivor different than one, well, it's kind of obvious, is that this is a Star Wars game and those games aren't, and the other one being that the Souls games are characteristically more difficult than Jedi Survivor. That's of course not to say that Jedi Survivor is not without challenge, as there's several different difficulties that you can choose from, but for the most part it's challenging enough to keep you engaged. But for those that have played Fallen Order, I would say that Survivor is not as difficult. That might be that they've made the game easier, but I do believe it also has to do with the fact that Respawn has thrown more tools for you to use in the manner of different lightsaber forms, going from Fallen Order's 2 lightsaber forms, which are basically just single and double-bladed lightsaber, to having a briskly paced dual saber stance where you're holding one saber in each hand. Or you can use the classy fencing-like blaster and saber stance, and my favorite one is the heavier and more damaging crossguard saber made famously by Kylo Ren in the sequels. Especially the saber and blaster and crossguard stances I really enjoyed. For saber and blaster, you're basically working with attack cancellations and setting up minor damage to enemies while they are away, and then the crossguard saber is what in a Souls game you would call a strength build, where you have this heavy, slow to wind up and slow to react attack that does a major amount of damage. I especially love the executions that you can do with these stances that are just brutal and gangsta at the same time. For instance, with the blaster stance, you can execute an enemy by slashing at him a couple times, and when you have him in the block with your saber, Cal will reach out to his blaster and pop him right in the face. The even more brutal crossguard execution that I love seeing every time has Cal basically sweeping the legs of the enemy, cutting them off, and while the enemy with his torso intact is desperately trying to reach for his weapon, Cal will swing down his saber and stab him right through the chest. But overall, the additions for the combat are just what I needed to keep the game feeling fresh. It's one of those that I would have been fine if they just added, maybe like dual sabers or something like that, but the fact that they added these 2 other stances that are even more baller is super cool, and I loved it. With the combat out of the way, I kind of want to touch on the traversal for a little bit, because for people that played Fallen Order and had some trouble with it, I'm very happy to say that the traversal has mostly been fixed, and there's a lot of variety in it, so let's talk about that. There's 6 main locations that you'll be playing through in Jedi Survivor, with the largest being the planet of Kobo, where you'll spend the most of your time in, because with Kobo it's essentially a larger open world with many areas to discover and quests to complete. Kobo really highlights some of the Souls or Metroidvania influences of these Respawn games, because there will be many areas that you look at and think, damn, yeah, that's pretty cool, I can't wait to come back here in like 5 hours when I actually have what the hell I need to traverse this. In this regard, it's really rewarding to come back to areas previously blocked so you can go in and access them with all these new tools at your disposal, followed by setting up the comical amount of zip lines that will get you from point A to point B quickly. The platforming has also had some major improvements. I know in Fallen Order there were some sections where it could be really janky, but thankfully it's nowhere near as bad as some of the sliding sections from Fallen Order that will just have Cal fall into Abyss like 5 times in a row because it just wouldn't let me jump in the right way. And the improved traversal is great because the array of locations for Cal to explore are pretty baller, ranging from the urban nightmare of Coruscant, the vastness of Kobo's open world, or visiting the ancient space station on its shattered moon. What I also really enjoy is that the locations for the most part are brand new to the experience, the only ones that have been seen in other Star Wars media being Coruscant and another planet that I don't want to spoil. It might not seem like much, but it's always great to see new locations instead of just the same 15 planets that Star Wars sometimes seems to get hung up on. Okay, now with the gameplay wholly out of the way, we gotta talk about the narrative and where it went and the tone that they chose for it, because man, I just ate it up. If Fallen Order was the series' A New Hope, we're introduced to a cast of new characters to fall in love with, then Jedi Survivor is very much the series' The Empire Strikes Back. Needless to say that while still a fun and adventurous, adventure, Jedi Survivor at many times throughout its story takes a much darker tone, whether it be dealing with the loss of friends along the way, the friends that you do have breaking up and going their own different paths, or having to live in a dark age where the ideals you hold dear have been thoroughly destroyed. It was incredible to see the journey that Cal, Grease, Seer, and Merrin went on from being isolated, downtrodden folks going their own way to how the story completes their individual arcs. There's also new villains that have their own reasons and motivations for being who they are, and they're very, very interesting and completely valid. And they come across more as anti-heroes than they do a Darth Vader or an Emperor Palpatine. As with Cal being a Jedi, there's always this dance between the light and the dark side of the Force, and whether or not to form attachments that, while I will not spoil it, the dance gets developed in really interesting ways that sometimes are really expected and other times are really refreshing and surprising. It makes Cal out to be a much more interesting character when he's not just a typical idealized version of a Jedi that we're all accustomed to, and there's some points in this game that make you question the path that he's going down, while at the same time still cheering him on. And whoo boy, there's some plot twists in Jedi Survivor that, while some were expected, there's other ones that I didn't expect at all and really made the narrative that much more interesting. It was a sort of, what? She was this thing the whole time? And not in the way that you think of, because I thought that character was gonna be that way, but not like that. And I know this is a whole bunch of nonsense, but once you get to it and you get it, you'll get it. Of course, if you don't really care about Star Wars, then you're not going to enjoy it as much as I will, but man, oh man, the narrative of Jedi Survivor really knocked it out of the park for me, and I was glad that I was able to experience it while at the same time shaking my head at the people sleeping on this game. To cap it off, I think we should probably talk about the game's presentation and the performance, because how the game launched and how it is now is very different, so let's talk about that. Firstly, I'm going to say that if you were following the discourse when this game came out, you would have heard it had a disastrous launch with nasty optimization issues on PC that thankfully by the second month, which to be honest is still an unacceptable amount of time, ended up getting fixed where I could enjoy the game at a stable frame rate. For those that are worried about the performance of the game still, there are some options at attaining the game for more affordable prices that I'll talk about soon near the end that might help you decide one way or the other. But going back to the presentation, I think the game looks great for a Star Wars game, and the moments that really highlighted it for me were the performances of Cameron Monaghan as Cal Kestis, Deborah Williams as Seer Junda, and basically every single other black lady in video games, Daniel Roebuck as Grease Dritus, who is quite literally me, and man oh man, I love that guy so much, and of course Tina Ivlev as the Night Sister Merrin. They all killed it in this game and really brought some tearjerker moments to the narrative, as well as moments that will have you laughing, smiling, and feeling happy for all the characters and where they end up going. Another spectacle of the presentation are some of the awesome set pieces where they used the most of what a fight between two capable Jedi should look like, which is some cool ass lightsaber duels that will always put a smile on my face. This, when mixed together with Stephen Barton and Gordy Habb's soundtrack, is a little match made in heaven, because these guys know how to make a soundtrack for a Star Wars game that doesn't pull on the stereotypical motifs that you always hear in most of the licensed Star Wars media. So, to put it all together, I gotta say that Star Wars Jedi Survivor for me, fellas, was such a wonderful, great experience that leveled up on every single little foundation that was put in Fallen Order, to the point that I would call it a perfect sequel. When I mean perfect sequel, I mean something to the likes of going from Batman Arkham Asylum and then booting up Batman Arkham City, where it takes all the mechanics, the narrative, and the presentation of the prior game and then perfects them for a sequel. That's not to say that Jedi Survivor is a perfect game, but as an improvement from Fallen Order, it's everything that I would have hoped for, and genuinely so much more, to the point that it made it up here to this point on the list. If you enjoy Star Wars game, then it's an absolute no-brainer for me to recommend Jedi Survivor, and if you have not played it or Fallen Order, then you should go back and play Fallen Order as well, because it's just as fantastic of an experience as Jedi Survivor. You can grab Jedi Survivor on most major platforms for €70 or $90 Canadian, but you can also at the moment play it on the EA Play Pro subscription, which is EA's sort of Game Pass subscription model, for about €15. Though in the future, I would not be surprised if it goes to normal EA Play, which at that point you can just play it as part of your normal Game Pass subscription if you're subscribed into that. There you have it, fellas. That was the incredible Star Wars Jedi Survivor at number 2, but as they say in Highlander, they can only be one. So, let's get into number 1.
Number 1.
In a horror story, there are only victims and monsters. And the trick is not to end up as either. But trapped by the genre, we're all ripped to pieces along the way.
No! Welcome! We have a great show for you here tonight. Alan Wake, one of my all-time favorite writers, and this on the show. He's here to talk about his latest book. Initiation tells the story of a fictional writer named Alan Wake, who is trapped in a nightmare, desperately trying to find the manuscript of a novel he has forgotten he has written.
Did you write these pages, Mr. Wake?
I'm trying to remember it.
You're the killer, the cult bleeding.
No! You've got the wrong man! It's my fault! It got out!
Wake has a double. Where is he now?
I don't want to be in the story, just write me out of the story.
Ooh, if you fellas knew me, then you damn well knew that this game was gonna make it onto the list, and this game, of course, is Alan Wake 2, the long-awaited sequel to Remedy Entertainment's Alan Wake that came out all the way back in 2010. Alan Wake 2 takes place 13 years after the events of the first Alan Wake and follows two characters, the first being Saga Anderson, an FBI investigator with special cognitive abilities sent with her partner Alex Casey to the sleepy Washington state town of Bright Falls to uncover a cult that has been murdering people who were recently rediscovered after being missing for dozens of years. The other character we follow is, of course, the titular Alan Wake, who after the events of the previous game has been found trapped in the Dark Place, a sort of dimension that's a dark reflection of our own reality, and his journey is a loop of finding a way to get out and reunite with his wife Alice. So it's up to the both of them to work together through different dimensions to get out of this fine mess created by the fine Finnish folks over at Remedy Entertainment. This is one of those games that, man, oh man, I did not think that Alan Wake was going to get a sequel, but I am so glad that Sam Lake and the team at Remedy Entertainment was able to create my top game of 2023. Starting off as usual with the gameplay, Alan Wake 2 is essentially the perfect creation of a survival horror game as we know it in the modern day. So it basically looks like as if you were playing Resident Evil or Dead Space or a whole slew of other survival horror games from the third person's perspective. That means you're going to be playing a vulnerable character with a limited supply of tools and ammunition at your disposal to defeat legions of shadowy, twisted humans known as the Taken, who have been, well, taken by the dark presence to cause havoc. This brings us to the first big gameplay gimmick that Alan Wake has for us, and that is because these are twisted humans shrouded in darkness, you actually have to use your trusty flashlight to destroy a layer of darkness before you actually harm them with firearms. And it certainly might not seem as a diverse of a range of weapons as Dead Space or have quite the tactile control of Resident Evil, but the sort of two-form gimmick of combat for Alan Wake really works, and the game makes up for it also in other regards that those other two games couldn't even reach for. This is by having the narrative split, but also still connected between Saga Anderson and Alan Wake, and each of them have their own interesting mechanics. Saga and Alan, for starters, both have a sort of hub room that they can interact with to look at clues, think about the literal plot, and otherwise upgrade your weapons, look at videos, and so on. Saga's is the Mind Place, which is a variant of the Mind Palace technique that allows her to connect the dots in the investigation in all aspects, such as the cult that has been haunting Bright Falls or figuring out the connections between various characters in town, like the Koskela brothers from nearby Watery, Washington, America's Little Finland. She can also profile people in her head to try and intuit seemingly hidden information from characters and have things to hide, whether it be the wild geezer rockers on the Rockers tour in Odin, or the aforementioned Ilmo and Jaakko Koskela, who run Watery's Kalevala Nights biker club and coffee world, a sad representation of the Finns' love for all things coffee. Alan Wake, on the other hand, has different mechanics that make his journey interesting in his own right, which many have to do with the fact that he is a writer. Alan's place of respite is the writer's room, where he is currently trying to write the manuscript for Initiation and Return, his own ways of working within the rules of the Dark Place to find a way to quite literally write him out of the story. In this sense, all throughout the Dark Place, there will be opportunities for him to follow the story that he seemingly wrote for Alex Casey, who is investigating a cult not too unfamiliar to the one that Saga is also investigating in reality. What this means is that in the Dark Place, he'll investigate locations with different drafts of this manuscript that will change aspects of his location. This could be where he's writing about the cult burning down a metro car, and then the world will reflect that with the metro being burnt to a crisp. Or it could be a screening of one of Tom Zane's infamous Finnish films, which will then screen said film. You can also switch between Alan and Saga at will by going into the janitor's closet and staring into the abyss of the puddle. Now don't ask me what that's about, because this video is, oh boy, it'll be like 3 times as long if I had to explain what this is about. And while there's no set order that you have to play the different chapters, there will be times where if you say you go too far in Alan's story, you'll have to pick up Saga's to catch up, but thankfully both sides are equally as interesting to play, so there shouldn't really be a problem. Now with the gameplay out of the way, let's talk about the most important element of Alan Wake 2, and that is the wonderful, wonderful narrative that those freaky Finns at Remedy Entertainment have crafted for us. The narrative of Alan Wake 2 is honestly kind of hard to put into words because in many ways it's so dense and obtuse, not to mention incredibly surreal and bizarre, but at the heart of it there's themes of isolation, corruption, and as pompous as this might sound, the death of the auteur. Though I especially love how different the two characters' journeys are in tone and in location, for you have Saga's investigation through Bright Falls that is this mixed up mix of Twin Peaks and True Detective when it comes to not just the quirky characters but also the visceral, raw murders and the cults going around. Alan's, on the other hand, is the tale of a man being trapped and isolated in a domain where you don't really quite know if it is a hell of your own creation. And then it's layered with semi-real and semi-surreal depictions of what he's currently writing and what he has already written, with the case of Alex Casey, who is just his world's Max Payne. But similarly to the quirky aspects of Saga's dealings with the townfolks in reality, there are sequences in Alan's story that are just as unbelievable as they are weird and intricately connected to the rest of Remedy's shared universe. Though it's when the stories start to align together is when we see some real juicy stuff come forward, like how parts of the story start to take place in reality and we get to a point where the players have no real clue on what's real and what's been rewritten, or even if the whole thing was just kind of a ploy from the beginning. In this way, how the two characters are connected, it sets up the themes that even through dimensions and differing hells, that we are never really truly alone, and to find a way to ask people for help, because if you don't, the hell that you've created might just corrupt and consume you whole. Another big aspect that I really loved about Alan Wake 2 were the characters, and the characters in the game don't just extend to Alan or Saga. Fellas, as with any great narrative, the characters are a central part of it, and I honestly loved being in the shoes of Saga, who's trying to go through this investigation that the deeper and deeper she gets into, it starts to infect her own life, and the shoes of Alan, who's been tormented in the Dark Place for 13 long years, and his Icarus-like journey to get the hell out of there. But I also have to give it to other characters that take up the stage at various points, such as Alex Casey, who's not just a real FBI agent, but also a character that Alan Wake created that is basically like Max Payne, and how the real Casey and the figurative Casey differ when experiencing them from Saga or Alan's perspective. Another favorite duo of mine that returned from the original Alan Wake are Tor and Odin, which are geezer rockers from a wonderful band known as the Old Gods of Asgard that have a deep history to Bright Falls and Cauldron Lake and all the nastiness that's going on. And the way that their story develops is very satisfying for those that enjoyed the first game, and if you haven't played it, you should really go back and play the first Alan Wake. And finally, as mentioned, the Koskela brothers are a great addition that adds just that extra little bit of swominess to the narrative that slowly but surely Remedy is more comfortable in expressing their Finnish perspective and culture. And as a fella that when some Finnish schmo comes up to me and says, "Oh, mitä vitun, satana," I know exactly what he's talking about, so every time I get to see anything Finnish, it really puts a smile to my face, and I love to share these things with other people. Lastly, I would like to touch on the presentation of Alan Wake 2 and how there's this multimedia approach to it that doesn't feel strange or forced in any way, and the longer that Remedy makes these games, the better they are at pulling it off. Firstly, Alan Wake 2 is an absolutely gorgeous game that will make your poor rig go down to its knees with how much power you're going to need to get it to run. But I will say, fellas, that if you can run it well, then it's more than worth it. Beautiful sunsets with the orange sun reflecting on Cauldron Lake, or the ethereal swallowing darkness of the dark place, create these incredible environments and vistas that are a sight to behold. The lighting in this game, especially with ray tracing, is absolutely out of this world, and when it works with various what I would call live action effects, it comes out perfectly. Now, to talk about the mixed media element of the game, what I mean by that is that Remedy uses a perfect mix of live action actors, sequences, and music created for the game that injects the world with many varieties of diegetic media. For instance, all throughout Alan's journey in the dark place, there will be echo events that showcase the investigation that Alex Casey is trying to get to the bottom of, and these are all portrayed in live action by the game director, Sam Lake, who was the OG face of Max Payne back in the day. You also see this with the use of Ilka Vidi, who's one of the actors who portrays Alan Wake when it comes to the live action sequences, but he is dubbed over by Matthew Peretta, who's a talented voice actor and a Remedy regular. But on a sadder note, I would like to highlight that the voice actor for Alex Casey, which was James McCaffrey, sadly passed away not too long ago after the release of Alan Wake 2. James McCaffrey might not have been a most recognizable voice actor, and his credits in video games are not what I would call extensive, but to me he was the original gritty voice actor for Max Payne that, like for me and others, was part of this series of incredible games by Remedy that I hold dear. He also played Zachariah Trench in 2019's Control, where he also did a lot of the live action sequences for when you were contacted on the phone, and as per usual, he knocked it out of the park. With Alan Wake, he performed the voice for Alex Casey that is basically this universe's Max Payne, and it was a treat to enjoy his performances, especially in Alan Wake 2, and honestly, it's really tragic to hear that he is no longer with us. So with that, condolences to his family and his many friends all over the world, especially his friends at Remedy Entertainment that have known him for so long. But with that, Mr. James McCaffrey, I hope you're up there looking down on us and watching everybody enjoy everything that you've created. Lastly, I want to touch on the incredible music that was specifically created for Alan Wake 2, which ranges from the songs that we hear at the end of all the chapters to the continued collaboration between Remedy Entertainment and Finnish rock band Poets of the Fall, and the creation of even more Old Gods of Asgard music. And this time around, there's a few more Old Gods of Asgard songs to throw into the mix, between the rompous Dark Ocean Summoning, the somber and emotional Anger's Remorse, and the one that everyone seems to have on their mind and they all love, which is the wonderful power ballad of Herald of Darkness. Though out of all the songs, I have to say the one that impacted me the most is the sequence that Anger's Remorse plays in, which without spoiling it, has this incredible visual that just entranced me for long periods of time just to look at it while hearing the music in the back. One final musical note, no pun intended, that I want to leave on is that somehow Remedy got the artist Poe to come out of retirement to create the music track that plays at the end of all of Alan's chapters that's called This Road, which is a genuine treat to listen to, especially since they used her song Haunted as the track at the end of one of the episodes for the original Alan Wake all the way back in 2010. Honestly, fellas, Alan Wake 2 is my game of the year because it's the only game that day in and day out I think about constantly. And while I do think very constantly about Star Wars Jedi Survivor and Stasis Bone Totem, the difference is that between those three games, there's only one game that has me listening and jamming my head to Herald of Darkness every single time I head into work. I've been saying this for a while now, but I honestly feel that Remedy Entertainment and especially Sam Lake deserve the same sort of video game auteur status that Hideo Kojima has gotten himself into. I think his narratives and use of mixed media are really unique, and there's honestly nobody else in the industry that makes games quite like those freaky Finns do, all the way in Espoo, Finland. I always highly recommend that you go back and play through their catalog because every single release that Remedy Entertainment has done, from Max Payne to Control to Alan Wake, are incredible adventures that will keep you satisfied for a long time. And of all the adventures that they have crafted over the years, none of them have been as well crafted, intricate, and as ambitious as the tour de force that was Alan Wake 2. You can grab Alan Wake 2 on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox, but only digitally and for the price of €50 or $65 Canadian, and on PC it's an Epic Game Store exclusive, and while I usually hate this, for Remedy I'll make an exception since it's wholly worth it every time. Oh man, so there you have it fellas, here we are at the end of the list, and I gotta say 2023 was a wild ass year with just stacks and stacks and stacks of great games for people to enjoy. Man, fellas, I don't really remember such an eventful year since probably like 2007, or hell, maybe even 2017, but even that's pushing it. But thankfully, it looks like 2024 will be just as packed with great stuff to play. Though I will say that some of my most anticipated games from the last year's top 10 didn't quite make it to 2023, but I'm not going to repeat myself, and I'll have 3 other games that I'm going to pick from that I'm excited for in 2024. Though if you were curious, those 2 games that didn't make it to 2023 were Stalker 2, Heart of Chernobyl, and Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine 2. But for the new list, first one that is coming probably later in the year is Atlus's newest IP and something that P Studio has been cooking up for a while now, and that is Metaphor Refantatio, or Refantasio, which is how everybody else is saying, but no, I'm not going to say it that way. And this game basically looks like advancing the gameplay of Persona with different social links and whatnot, but putting it into a less structured fantasy JRPG that looks fantastic. Now you might ask me, hey, isn't Persona 3 Reload on this list? Personally, I don't think it should be on the list because 1, I'm already playing it and loving it, and 2, I think Metaphor Refantatio is more interesting of a new game. Second one on this list, which a lot of people seem to want to hate for no reason at all, but I'm a crackhead for this sort of stuff, so I'd like to eat it up. And that is, of course, Massive Entertainment's Star Wars Outlaws, which is the first open world Star Wars game, and while I'm not entirely convinced of the tired Ubisoft formula, I'll happily eat it up if it's Star Wars. Lastly, another Lucasfilm Games collaboration and Machine Games' long-awaited Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, which I hope redeems the studio from the really lackluster, in my opinion, Wolfenstein: The New Colossus, which was one of the most disappointing games of that year when it came out. I'm a big fan of Indiana Jones and the Emperor's Tomb for the Xbox and the PS2, and if that game is even a fraction of how great the Emperor's Tomb is, then I'll probably love it as well. And of course, there's many more games to enjoy in 2024 that I don't have the time to list, but we'll all find out how great or stinky they end up being this year. So we'll see you for the next top 10. So with that, fellas, we finally made it to the end of this video, and for anybody still watching, thank you so much for making to the end here. I really do appreciate it. These giant lists are always a huge endeavor. So with that, I would love to hear what were your guys' top 10, or did you have a game that you loved this year? It doesn't even have to be a game that came out last year. It could be a game that you played for the first time last year, or hell, even something that you're looking forward to in the future. So if you got anything like that, put it down in the comments and I'd love to hear about it. So I'd love to read that stuff from you guys. But from that, for anybody here that's, been a fan of the channel since forever, thank you so much. But if you're a newcomer here, man, I hope you enjoyed the program. I'm sorry that your first taste of the Tomthechosen1 experience is this hour-and-a-half plus feature length video, but sometimes people like that. So if you're new and you enjoyed it, maybe just leave a like, or maybe subscribe if you really enjoyed it. But with that, fellas, we gotta end this stuff. So with that, I just gotta say for 2024, it's another hopeful year with a lot of great stuff to play. We're still gonna do our top 10s for next year, of course, but at the same time, we're gonna continue doing the Tomcast, and this time around with all 4 of our hosts in one room at the same time, which makes it really awful for me to edit, but also with that, there's going to be more videos this year as well. It's not going to be the output of last year around this time, which was crazy, but I was also, kind of unemployed. But it's not going to be bad like the end of last year where I kind of dropped the ball and didn't really do anything. But so with that way, we're going to hopefully meet in the middle. And with that, man, oh man, this is Tomthechosen1 sitting here in nice sunny, actually no. Hell no, it's not sunny. It's foggy as hell. It's so foggy that I hear my neighbor go out, "Oh Dio, a Silent Hill." So with that, there's a guy named Pizza Head outside of my door, and he's going to stab me through the chest with a spear. So I gotta get my gun and get the hell out of here. So you fellas, take it easy.